Dr. Gathercole, his academia is in your booklet. I don't need to share that with you. Instead, I want to tell you something about him as a person. I believe that he is one of the bright shining stars in academia of evangelical faith. He's got a heart for God. You see it in the passion he has for his faith. You see it in the passion he has for his family. And you see it in the passion he has for his friends. He's a very busy gentleman who comes and speaks as requested if he can fit it into his schedule. He is a gentleman who is on the NIV translation board. And so if you use the New International Version of the Bible, you've got him as part of the reason to thank, or not if you don't like it. It's always fun. He and Peter Williams both live in Cambridge, and Peter, of course, is a friend of the library who's out here quite often. Peter is on the English Standard Version translation board, so it's fun just to get them in a room and watch them dicker over verbs. No, they are very good friends and comrades in what we're about here for the kingdom. So I will just tell you this. Almost all of you who've been to any of my classes have had the indirect influence of Simon. He's one of these people I can email with my questions. I can find myself in Cambridge and he'll drop what he's doing to have breakfast with me and help me figure out how to best teach New Testament Greek in a life group setting. He's an amazing resource to us even when he's not speaking for us. And so I want you to join me in thanking him for being here tonight and listen with your open hearts.
I appreciate everyone being here. I've had wonderful hospitality in the last 48 hours. It feels like not so much that I've had meals, but sort of one meal with about sort of 40 courses with occasional breaks for breathing. That's Texas. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm sure you know that the four Gospels, the four New Testament Gospels, are very often under attack, whether it's from scholars, skeptical scholars, or in the media, or in the way in which what scholars and the media say trickles down just to the general public. We commonly hear conspiracy theories about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and what they say. They're sometimes accused of being just fiction, sometimes accused of being myth, or sometimes accused of trying to do history, but just doing history very badly. Now, what I wanted to do today is really to just put one plank, just drill down into, I'm getting my metaphors mixed up, drill down into one plank, to put one plank in place in the case for the reliability of the Gospels. And what I want to do specifically in this lecture is to demonstrate that the geography of the Gospels, the four New Testament Gospels, helps us see that these Gospels really reflect the culture of Jesus, really reflect the culture that they claim to reflect. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's very helpful to look at the geography of the Gospels is that detailed geographical knowledge is very hard to fake. It's quite hard to fake in the present, but it's especially hard to fake in the ancient world when there were no atlases, there were no Lonely Planet guides or rough guides which you can consult to find out about the geography of faraway places. So if you were trying to write an account of Jesus and his ministry and his disciples traveling around Galilee, you'd either have to rely on eyewitness testimony, rely on actual knowledge, sources which have actual knowledge of the place, or you'd be bound to get it wrong. Let me tell you a bit about how this talk came about. I was giving another talk about a year ago in the classics faculty in Cambridge University, where I myself was a student in classics. And it was organized by the Christian students, put on for the staff and the students in the faculty. And it was the question was is Jesus just another Hercules? In other words, is Jesus just another sort of mythical superhero figure? And in the course of explaining the sort of historical reality of Jesus and the historical authenticity of the Gospels, I just made a sort of passing remark about the geography of the Gospels being one of the reasons for seeing the plausibility of them. And just before, about an hour before I went in to do the talk, I thought I'll just do a quick search of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian Josephus. I'll just do a quick search to see if he knows of any of these the more obscure places. Of course, he's going to refer to Jerusalem and Jericho and the big places, but I wonder if he knows any of these little obscure places. And what I found was actually very surprising. I thought maybe Josephus will know one or two of these villages that I can just drop into sprinkle into the talk. But actually what I found, to my surprise, was Josephus knows a great deal about these places, even the little tiny villages that Jesus visits in the course of his ministry. So what I want to do in this lecture really is, in some ways, to talk you through the experience that I had of surprise, of what I found absolutely fascinating in the geographical movements of Jesus in the course of his ministry are really backed up by a lot of other sources from the time, a lot of other Jewish sources from the time. So what we can see there is the way in which there are lots of testimonies in Jewish literature to what we see in the Gospels. Now, I'm not going to focus on archaeology here, but really just discoveries in literary sources, partly to keep in the time, but also I'm not an expert in archaeology. Now, on my count, there are 27 towns named in the Gospels. And what I want to do in the course of this lecture is, really mainly in three parts, go through which of the towns are mentioned in the Old Testament, then which of the towns are mentioned in the first century historian Josephus that I mentioned, and then thirdly, to look at a slightly more obscure area, the Rabbinic literature. Then at the end, I'm going to compare these results with some other writers, and that will become clear what's involved then later. So again, what I'm going to do is look at the references to the towns in the Gospels and how they're backed up in other literature from the time, specifically Jewish literature. So first of all, Old Testament places. A number of the places in the Gospels, as we might expect and as we might know, are already known, already mentioned in the Old Testament. And some of these were actually major international cities. So, for example, Jerusalem. We know Jerusalem, of course, from the many, many places that it appears in the Old Testament. But it also appears in a kind of archive from Egypt from the second millennium, probably the 14th century BC, written in Akkadian mainly, and we see Jerusalem referred to as the town of Urushalim. And this correspondence, where we have this, is usually called the Amarna letters, or the Tel El Amarna letters. Now, in one of these letters, the chief of Jerusalem is a chap called Abdu Heba, and he's always worried about losing his territory. And so he writes to his sort of overlord, really, the Pharaoh of Egypt, begging him often to send archers to help recapture the territory or defend the territory that he's in danger of losing. So this is one example of this. So Abdu Heba writes as follows: "To the king, my lord, thus says Abdu Heba, thy servant, if this year there are archers, then the lands and the region will belong to the king, my lord. But if there are no archers, the lands and the regions will not belong to the king. Behold, this land of Urushalim, neither my father nor my mother gave it to me. The mighty arm of the king gave it to me." So you can see behind the rather parasitic language here that Jerusalem and the territory around it are sort of in the possession of this underlord, Abdu Heba, but who owes his authority really to the Pharaoh. Jerusalem is also mentioned a lot in classical sources, just giving you a selection here. And there's one particularly nice comment by Pliny the Elder. You may have noticed that his The date of his death is very specific there, the 25th of August, 79. Perhaps you know that. The reason that we know the precise date is because Pliny was killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And he commented that Jerusalem is by far the most famous city, not only of Judea, but of the whole of the East. And of course, we can still see Jerusalem today. When we come to another major city, Jericho, often described as one of the towns perhaps with the longest continual settlement in history as far as we know it, one of the most ancient cities that we know of. And we find sources both in the Old Testament and outside referring frequently to Jericho, or Jericho as it's sometimes called. So Jericho is the city of the palm trees in Deuteronomy, and centuries later, again, Pliny the Elder refers to it as the Jericho with many palm groves. And you can still see those palm trees as well today. Now, Tyre and Sidon, again, ancient cities, well-known international cities, right at the sort of top northwestern point of Jesus' ministry, the furthest sort of northwest that he went, really into pretty pagan territory, into the territory of Israel's traditional enemies. Now, these are also mentioned frequently in Egyptian sources, in particular in this beautiful manuscript here in the British Museum. And I've given you a sort of crib here where you can see where Sidon and Tyre appear. And I'm grateful to the Egyptologist Jim Hoffmeyer for checking my hieroglyphs here. I wouldn't want to pretend to be an Egyptologist without getting someone to check it. Tyre and Sidon here appear in a list of places visited or claimed to be visited by an Egyptian traveller. Bethlehem, again, one of the most famous places in the Gospels, referred to in the Old Testament, where Rachel died and was buried. And it also appears in these Amarna letters, in these tablets from this archive, this Egyptian archive, where it's called Bit Lahmi, a town of the land of Jerusalem, as we know, a place very near to Jerusalem. Tyre and Sidon, by the way, also appear in these tablets. Now, here again, Abdu-Heber, remember the sort of underlord who owes his authority to the Pharaoh, is again anxious about losing his territory. Here we have it. To the king, my lord, say, now even a town of the land of Jerusalem, Bit Lahmi by name, a town belonging to the king, has gone over to the side of the people of Keilah. Let my king hearken to Abdu-Heber, thy servant, and let him send archers to recover the royal land for the king. So again, a similar desperate plea from Abdu-Heber again. And we've got several other Old Testament towns which are also featured in the Gospels. So Ephraim, for example, mentioned a couple of times in the Old Testament. Ephraim is the place in John's Gospel where Jesus goes to lay low for a while. And Arimathea, of course, famous not so much as the place where Jesus visited, but as the place where Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Jesus, came from. Now, Arimathea is a little bit unclear, but it can probably be identified with Ramah in the book of Samuel in particular, which has a lot of different spellings. It's either Ramah, or it's Harama, or it's Armathaim, or Haramathaim, or Haramatha. One of those places where you sort of slur the pronunciation when you name it. But you can see here the forms Armathaim and Haramathaim, very similar to the way it's written in the New Testament, Arimathea. So this first set of gospel places would have been known to Christians throughout Christian history, both from the Gospels and from the readings that they would have heard from the Old Testament as well. So these are very uncontroversial examples of gospel place names, widely known to Jews and Christians from the Old Testament. And, of course, from the Old Testament, they find their way into lots of the early Christian literature and also into lots of the early Jewish literature as well. So apart from, this map isn't very clear perhaps, but up in the northwest there you've got Tyre and Sidon, but most of the other places referred to in the Old Testament are sort of clustered in the area around Jerusalem, Abdu Heber's territory, you might say. So of the 27 places, remember I mentioned 27 towns in the Gospels at the beginning, we start off with Jerusalem, Jericho, Tyre, Sidon, Bethlehem, Ephraim, and what's the last one? Arimathea. Thank you. So, as I say, after that, these then become very familiar in early Jewish and Christian literature. So this is our first batch of places where we have testimony outside of the Gospels to confirm the places. Now, the second group that I want to mention is a set of places not found in the Old Testament, but which have still been known fairly widely, or for not so much fairly widely, but for a long time throughout Christian history. And those are the towns which we hear of in the Jewish historian Josephus. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote wrote 4 works: a larger history of the Jews, a more compressed history of the Jewish war in the first century, and also a short book, an autobiography, and also a short defense of the Jewish people against some Egyptians who had made rude remarks about the Jews. And Josephus was particularly well placed, even though he was writing in Rome at the time. He was well placed to talk about the geography of Judea and Galilee, because he had been a general during the Jewish war and had moved around a great deal during that time. So a lot of the places that as I mentioned, to my surprise, I found that a lot of the places, even obscure places in the Gospels, turn up in Josephus. Now, as I say, Josephus has been known, at least to an elite few, for quite a long time throughout church history. He's first mentioned in the 160s or 170s by a church father, Theophilus of Antioch. And after that, Christians get hold of Josephus and copy him because, of course, what he says is of relevance to Jewish history and the New Testament, the sort of context of the New Testament. And so we have manuscripts of Josephus from the sort of 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries up into the beginning of printing, copied by Christians and talked about by at least an elite few ecclesiastical scholars. So he's been known to a few at least. And Josephus gives us another 7 gospel place names. First of all, Cana. Now, of course, Cana has 2 claims to fame, now we know. First, of course, that it was the place where Jesus performed his first miracle, turning the water into wine, revealing his glory. But rather less importantly, perhaps, it was also, for a short time at least, the place where Josephus had his base of operations during the Jewish war, probably around 66, 67, towards the beginning of the war. And Josephus writes, when in the course of describing plots against him, one of the major themes of his autobiography is his rivalry between himself and someone else called John of Giscala. And he reports that at that time, his abode was in a village of Galilee, which is named Cana. So Josephus and John's Gospel agree on the location of Cana, not just on the bare place name, but on the location of Cana in Galilee. And this was certainly one which surprised me that it turned up in Josephus. Josephus also goes to visit Capernaum, and again, this was another surprise for me. The place, of course, where Jesus forgave the paralyzed man's sins and healed the paralyzed man, cast out a demon in the synagogue, and according to Josephus here, Capernaum supplies men with the principal fruits, with grapes and figs continually during 10 months of the year, and the rest of the fruits as they become ripe together through the whole year. For besides the good temperature of the air, it is also watered from a most fertile fountain. The people of the country call it Capernaum, Kephar Nahum, the village of Nahum, the prophet Nahum. That's the Nahum at the end of Capernaum is the name of Nahum. And this is a picture of the synagogue in the place which most archaeologists identify as Capernaum. There's some debate about it, but a fairly likely site. And on the top here, the big white bricks, you have the 4th century synagogue, and at the base, the sort of darker, smaller bricks there is the base of the 1st century synagogue. And you can actually, where it's a bit broken in the floor of the synagogue, you can sort of peer down into the 1st century bit, which, of course, is referred to in Luke's Gospel, in Luke chapter 7, as the synagogue which was built by the Roman centurion, and of course which was preached in and miracles were done in by Jesus. So that's so much for Capernaum. Gadara, the next place, is an important city, not one of these small little villages, but a major Greek city of the Decapolis, that confederation of 10 cities east of the Jordan, which were of such prominence. And Josephus is particularly interested in these places which are militarily significant. And so Gadara here is a prime example of that. Refers to it as Gadara, the metropolis of Perea, in other words, the other side of the Jordan, which was a place of strength. So less surprising that Gadara should turn up in Josephus as a major town. Now, I mentioned that Josephus is particularly interested in the political and military situation of Galilee in his time, of course, because of the revolt going on against the Romans. And so he mentions often political changes that take place in these cities. So he writes, for example, about the upgrading of a town called Panias. And he mentions that when Philip the Tetrarch, or Herod Philip, as he's sometimes called, gets hold of Panias, and Herod Philip gives it a new name by calling it Caesarea, naming it after the emperor. When Philip also had built Panias, a city at the fountains of Jordan, he named it Caesarea. And these are the fountains of the Jordan, often thought to be where Caesarea Philippi is today. Now, elsewhere, Josephus calls it, in that second passage on the bottom there, he calls it explicitly Caesarea Philippi. And the Gospel writers and Acts as well call Caesarea Philippi to distinguish it from the much more famous Caesarea Maritima on the coast, which was a major city in the way that Caesarea Philippi wasn't really. Now, the first passage in Josephus that mentions Caesarea Philippi here goes on to talk about Bethsaida as well, of course. Remember the hometown of Philip, Andrew, and Simon, and of course the blind man who was healed there. Bethsaida is an interesting case. In the Gospels, Mark calls Bethsaida a village, whereas Matthew, Luke, and John call the same place, called Bethsaida, a town or a city. Now, how can Mark call Bethsaida a village and Luke, Matthew, and John call Bethsaida a city? Well, Josephus provides one possible answer here. When Philip, who also had built Panias, a city at the fountains of Jordan, he called it Caesarea, we've just done that, he also advanced the village of Bethsaida, located at the lake of Gennesaret, to the dignity of a city, both by the number of inhabitants it contained and its other grandeur, and called it by the name Julias. So that provides one possible solution to why one of the Gospels refers to Bethsaida as a village and other Gospel writers refer to Bethsaida as a city, because it was both. It was first of all a village, but almost around exactly the same time as Jesus' ministry, it was elevated by Philip to the status there of a city. And of course, we can see that there's agreement between Josephus and the Gospels about the location of Bethsaida as well. He advanced the village of Bethsaida there, located at the lake of Gennesaret. Bethsaida located at the lake of Gennesaret. And lo and behold, who do we know of from from this hometown of Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida, being a sort of dignified city, didn't really catch on, and it didn't sort of forge itself really as a major place. But one place which was very significant, which was built at around the same time and became the most important city in Galilee eventually, was Tiberias. It's actually, surprisingly, a fairly minor place in the Gospels, one where crowds come from to hear Jesus, but which Jesus himself doesn't actually visit. So we don't have a reference to Jesus visiting the town of Tiberias. It's referred to, as I say, as a place where people come from to hear Jesus, and the Sea of Galilee is sometimes also called the Sea of Tiberias. But it's a very significant place. It's mentioned by pagan authors, Ptolemy and Pliny, as well as Josephus, and as a sign of its real Greek city status, it even had the authority, as you can see here, to mint its own coins. So that's what you've got there is Tib, and then Rias underneath. The first reference to Tiberias in Josephus is the place where he describes Herod Antipas's foundation of the town. And now Herod the Tetrarch, who was in great favor with Tiberias, built a city of the same name with him and called it Tiberias. He built it in the best part of Galilee at the lake of Gennesaret. There are warm baths at a little distance from it in a village called Emmaus. Now, of course, mentioning Emmaus leads us on to the question of the Emmaus, the road to Emmaus, where Jesus walked with his two friends after his resurrection, of course. But don't be misled, don't be deceived. This is not the same Emmaus, because, of course, this is an Emmaus in Galilee, near Tiberias. Now, it would have been a bit of a trek for the people to walk from Jerusalem to this Emmaus in a single day and back again on the third day. But we do have in Josephus reference to that other Emmaus near Jerusalem. And here we can see what sort of a place Emmaus was. He, that's Vespasian, the Roman emperor at the time of the end of the Jewish war, founded no city in Judea, but reserved the country for himself nevertheless. However, he did assign a place for 800 men whom he had dismissed from his army, which he gave them to live in. It is called Emmaus and is 30 stades from Jerusalem. So this fits much better with the Emmaus referred to in the Gospels, which of course is near to Jerusalem, and here it's referred to in Josephus, again for its sort of military significance. It's a little place, but it is a place where some of the Roman soldiers, when they were demobilized, were sort of put in as a colony. So that's our batch of towns referred to in the Gospels, backed up by Josephus outside of the Gospels there. In some cases, of course, as we've seen, not just the bare names, but geographical and information about their status as well. So Josephus, in addition to and of course Josephus here, we can see gives us a lot of information about Galilean places because that's where he was positioned during the Jewish revolt. So in addition to the places that we've already had from the Old Testament, we have an extra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There. So the table is filling up a little bit. Now, moving on from Josephus, we've got further evidence for gospel places in a rather more obscure branch of literature in the ancient rabbis. Here we are. Sorry. There we are. And unlike the Old Testament and Josephus, the ancient rabbis have really been only very little known to Christians down the ages. Very few, even of the most learned ecclesiastical scholars, knew anything at all about even biblical Hebrew, let alone being able to read the rabbis. It was even in some circles rather frowned upon to learn Hebrew in the Middle Ages. Some people thought, I can see a Hebrew scholar laughing at this. One ecclesiastical dignitary, for example, said, well, I suppose you could learn Hebrew. It might be harmless, I suppose. But others said, well, St. Augustine didn't know any Hebrew. It didn't do him any harm, so why bother? These are the kinds of remarks that were often made about learning Hebrew. It was sometimes thought to be a useful thing to learn, but purely as a sort of as an insight into linguistics and the sort of humanistic project in the Middle Ages. But there were a few small circles in which Hebrew was particularly known, and even a few circles as well in which rabbinic literature was known by Gentiles. There were, of course, a few Jewish converts who knew some Hebrew and rabbinic literature. But just to mention three of these little circles, here you've got a picture on the far left of Thomas Becket. And Thomas Becket had a secretary called Herbert of Bosham, and Herbert of Bosham was one of the few people who in the Middle Ages knew Hebrew and studied probably not rabbinic literature, but had contact with rabbis, because, of course, there were rabbis in northern France whom people could converse with in French. And so there was a circle of Herbert of Bosham and a few people from an abbey in northern France, Andrew and Richard of St. Victor, Hugh of St. Victor, who were to some degree familiar with what was going on in rabbinic discussions of the Bible as well. Also, there were some scholars in Italy in the 14th century. There's some evidence of collecting Hebrew manuscripts there. But probably the most sort of notorious and perhaps the most learned people in Hebrew were actually a commission set up in 1250 where the church chose a few, I think it was sort of 10 or 20 intelligent scholars to go and learn Oriental languages in order to engage in debate and refutation of Jewish theology. One of the things they did then was to write enormous great books, trying to argue, for example, that the Talmud, the Jewish literature itself, proves that Jesus was really the Messiah. One of the other tasks, more unsavory tasks in which these scholars were engaged, was in the censoring of manuscripts of the Talmud. And here you've got a page of the Jewish Talmud where you can see that certain sections of it have been rubbed out because of their sort of anti-Christian or suspected anti-Christian tendencies. And one particular member of this commission, a person called Raymond Martini, wrote a book called The Dagger of Faith. Now, The Dagger of Faith was an enormous, great encyclopedic work, quoting vast tracts of rabbinic Hebrew. He obviously really knew his stuff. He'd read pretty much everything he could get his hands on and understood it as well. And he was one of those people who tried to argue from Jewish literature itself, from the rabbis themselves, that this rabbinic literature really did indirectly prove that Jesus was the Messiah. But it was an enormous great book. It was only a few copies were made. It was so difficult for most people to read that it didn't really make much of an impact, although it did later when it was printed. Now, so as a result of this, there was very little known by Christians about any rabbinic literature. The real watershed for knowledge of the literature of the Jews by Christians came with the advent of printing. And so the first printing of the Hebrew Bible with rabbinic commentaries, the commentaries of the rabbis around it, came in 1516, 1517, very soon after the beginning of serious printing, printed by a Christian printer, Bomberg. And the first edition of the Babylonian Talmud, enormous great sort of collection of Jewish law, which I'll come back to in a moment, was printed between 1520 and 1523. And after these initial publications, because these were then distributed, of course, into lots of libraries, then Christian scholars were able to get to work and really study these texts. And the most important figure in the study of these texts at the beginning was a chap called John Lightfoot, who was master of St. Catherine's College in Cambridge in the 17th century. And this Lightfoot, of course, not to be confused, you may have come across a J.B. Lightfoot, who was also a great hero of Christian scholarship in the 19th century. This is a different John Lightfoot, not Joseph Lightfoot. And Lightfoot wrote a book or a series of books really, called Horai Hebraicae et Talmudicae, Hebraic and Talmudic exercitations, I think it's translated as in the English. And this was a great, vast work of massive learning, harvesting all the material that he could get his hands on at the time in Jewish literature and relating it to the Gospels. And some of what he does in this book concerns place names. So, for example, our first place name, Bethphage, which is on the Mount of Olives, not at the moment, but it used to be. Here, Lightfoot says, there is very frequent mention of this place in the Talmudists. So he then proceeds to enumerate some of the places. And one of the places that he mentions is from the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is the first sort of great foundational work of rabbinic law, which is then built on later. And at one point, the Mishnah deals with different interpretations of the showbread and the 2 loaves of bread, which are prescribed in Leviticus 23 and 24. I won't go into the great detail here. But the question here concerns where you can make the bread. So, first of all, we've got the general view, the standard view, after which we have 2 minority reports. The general view, the 2 loaves and the showbread were alike in that they were kneaded and rolled outside the temple court, but baked inside. Rabbi Judah, so the first minority report, which is a more strict view, Rabbi Judah says, no, they were wholly prepared inside the temple court. Then we get a sort of liberal view, if you will, the very sort of lenient view. Rabbi Simeon. It was always the custom, he says, it was always the custom to say the 2 loaves and the showbread were valid whether they were made in the temple court or in Bethphage. Now, Bethphage is just outside, not just the temple court, but just outside the city limit itself. And so this is a rather generous ruling in saying that you could make the bread even as far away as Bethphage, although not that far away, of course. It's only a very short distance away from the city. So Rabbi Simeon is making the generous ruling here. Now, just before the discussion of this in the Mishnah, we have a discussion of where the first fruits of the harvest can come from. Remember, the first fruits have to be offered as soon as they arrive, on the day that they arrive in the temple. And the Mishnah says that ideally this should come from very near Jerusalem, presumably because it would sort of go a bit sort of bad if it came from too far away. It still needs to be sort of fresh on arrival in Jerusalem. But that's not always possible. It's not always possible that they can come from very nearby. So this is what the ruling is about that. The best fulfillment of the commandment of the Omer, that's the first fruits, the best fulfillment of of presenting this grain in the temple is that it should come from a nearby place, a nearby land. But if the areas close to Jerusalem were not ripe yet, then they could bring them from any place. It once happened that it came from Gagot Srifin, and the 2 loaves came from the valley of Ein Socha or Ein Sukkah. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, the answer is because Ein Sukkah is almost certainly the Sychar of the Gospels, the place where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman in John's Gospel. Ein Sukkah means the well or fountain or spring of Sukkah. And Sukkah is the Greek spelling of what we have in our translations as Sychar. And of course, Sychar in the Gospels is a place where there is a spring, Jacob's well. So that's why it's pretty likely, I think, that Ein Sukkah is the Sychar of the Gospels. And it's implied here, of course, that this is a place a fair distance away from Jerusalem, somewhere where, in extreme case, you could bring the grain from. And of course, we know from John's Gospel that Sychar is a Samaritan city, so it's a good distance away from here. So, in this first great body of Jewish legal literature, we have references to Bethphage and Sychar. On top of the Mishnah, we then have the next great sort of story, the next story with an E, the next great layer of rabbinic law the Tosefta, literally the additions, as it means. Now, the Tosefta tells us, for example, that there was not just a lake called Gennesaret, but actually a town called Gennesaret as well, the place where Jesus and his disciples land after Jesus has walked on the water. So I want to go into one of the places where Gennesaret is mentioned in the Tosefta, but I need to do a bit of explaining first. According to Jewish law, one of the things that counted as work on the Sabbath, in other words, work that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath, was moving something from one domain into another. So, for example, moving something out of your house from your house out into the public domain, or out of your house into someone else's house. So this is a slight inconvenience, of course. So in the passage that I'm going to mention, the Tosefta here, one Rabbi Judah, sets his fine legal mind to try and get around this problem. Of course, that's what lawyers do, try and get around the law. So he tries to figure out a way of enabling you to move something from one domain into another without breaking the Sabbath. And the way you do this is by almost literally moving the goalposts, moving the boundaries between your place and another person's place. So what you do is, if you want to move something from one house to another house, you make the two houses into a single house. So let me illustrate this. So for example, you start off with two separate houses. Person A's domain, public space in between, and person B's domain. But if the owners of the houses both open their gates, ta-da, what do you have? Only one house. The gates join the houses together like this. So let's look at the way in which the Tosefta describes this case. The sages concede to Rabbi Yehuda, in other words, he persuaded them of this, in the case of Gennesar. So this was a case that arose in a town, obviously, not in the middle of a lake, but in the town of Gennesar. If person A opens the gate of his enclosed area and closes off the public domain, and person B opens the gate of his enclosed area and closes off the public domain, then they prepare an eruv. This is the mechanism for joining up the places, so that they may carry or set objects in the center, move around, place things from the private to the public, and reverse. So there you have, that was a roundabout way of saying there's also mention of Gennesaret in the rabbis. So after the Mishnah that we've mentioned, the foundation and the Tosefta, the additions, the next great edifice of Jewish legal text is the Talmud, the most famous one and the most authoritative for Jews today, especially the Babylonian Talmud. And with the town of Chorazin, I should have said Gennesaret. This is where the plain of Gennesaret, where Gennesaret was located. Chorazin, of course, is a place where Jesus pronounces woes against in the gospel because of their unrepentance. But Chorazin appears in a very different context in Jewish law, in the realms of how the bread, again, we're back to bread, for the Levitical offerings can be prepared. So what we have here is one case of that. Come and hear, Rabbi Yosef said, they would have brought it, that's the bread, even from the wheat of Karzayim or Chorazin, and from Kepha'achim, if only they had been nearer to Jerusalem. So Chorazin is a pretty good place, actually, for the rabbis. They grow the produce properly, they have the right methods of agriculture, but it's just too far away from Jerusalem, and as of course we know from the Gospels, it's in Galilee. Also in Galilee is the hometown of Mary Magdala, or as it is in the Talmud, Migdal Nunaya, the house of the fishes, appropriate for a place near the Sea of Galilee, where there's lots of archaeology going on about places where the fish were pickled and where they produced that ghastly sort of fish sauce, garum. But I don't want to turn your stomach at this point by talking about the fish sauce. Here, we've got a fermentation of a different kind, the fermentation of yeast. And this is about the fermentation of yeast in bread. So said Rabbi Barhu, in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Lachish, the period for fermentation of yeast in bread is as long as it takes a man to walk from Migdal Nunia to Tiberias, which is a mile. So the point is that if you leave the dough out for 20 minutes or so, then that's the time it turns into leaven. Now, I want to leave this world of rabbinic legal interpretation and go more into the biblical commentaries of the rabbis now, verse by verse, sequential commentary, which they also spent a lot of time engaged in. And this is a comment on Genesis 49:19, which in the Bible says, Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. And this is the interpretation of Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds, and the following verse as well. Like a donkey, Issachar is a strong donkey. Like a donkey is lower on both sides, but is upraised in the middle. So there is in Issachar a valley on both sides, and in the middle, mountains. Rather clever. What about crouching between the sheepfolds? This refers to the two valleys. And he saw that rest was good. This is going on into the next verse, verse 15. Where the rest was good, this is Tinam, and where the land was pleasant, this is Naim. Now, Naim is described as the pleasant place, to play on the Hebrew word Na'amah and Naim. Now, this is, of course, as we commonly find variation between M and N at the end of Hebrew words and Hebrew place names. This is the town of Nain from the Gospels. From the great commentary, Genesis, Rabbah means the great commentary on Genesis, the sort of ICC of the ancient world, or the word biblical commentary. But in addition to these great commentaries, there were also little commentaries, a sort of Bible Speaks Today sort of brief version. And this next extract is from one of these little commentaries, and a commentary on the Song of Songs. Rabbi Nehemiah said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, very common idiom in the Talmud, the Holy One, blessed be he, shows Israel the grave of Gog and Magog, and behold, the feet of the Shekinah will be upon the Mount of Olives, and the grave of Gog and Magog will be opened from the south of the Kidron Valley to Gegeshta on the east of the Sea of Tiberias. Now, Gegeshta, or as we know of it in the Gospels, Gergesa, again, it's common to have this extra T, like we saw with Rama and Ramatha and Arimathea, this variation with Rama. This Gergeshta or Gergesa is probably the correct reading for the place where the demon-possessed demons went into the pigs in Matthew's version of the account. There's a complicated manuscript history to this whole question, which I won't go into. But what we can see here is that the location, of course, of this Gergesa on the east of the Sea of Galilee matches exactly with the location where the event takes place in the Gospels as well. Now, finally, you may have noticed that there's one town sort of conspicuous by its absence so far, Nazareth. And the reason why I mention this, leave this to last, is that it's only in the last couple of generations that we've discovered any not extra biblical, but non-Christian testimony to the place Nazareth. It has very recently turned up in, and I need to give a bit of explanation here, in lists of priestly courses, priestly divisions. If you remember at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, is introduced because it's his turn to serve in the temple because he is of the priestly division of Abijah. And there were in the Old Testament, there were 24 of these priestly divisions, which sort of took turns to minister in the temple. And at some point, this lasted for a long time, and at some point, perhaps after one of the Jewish revolts, perhaps the revolt in 70, that ended in 70, or perhaps one of the two revolts in the early 2nd century, after one of these crises probably, priests moved to Galilee. And each priestly division was assigned a particular town in Galilee. And that's what we find here. The priestly courses survive both in inscriptions and in extensively, quite differently, in poetry as well. This first poem mentioning Nazareth was first published in 1909, and there are a lot more now that have been discovered. And this is just a couple of lines from it. "Nations thou shalt crush with afflicting plagues, over Nazareth may you renew your glance." So these horrible nations outside, the poet is calling upon to judge, but he's asking God to show favor to Nazareth again. And then there's Nazareth appearing as in a list of places in an inscription as well here, where you can see how the assignment of particular groups of priests goes to particular towns. So the 17th course of Hesea goes to Mamliach, the 18th course of Hapizez to Nazareth, and so on. So after 7 places in the Old Testament, 7 places in Josephus, we've got a number of places from the rabbis as well, scattered all over. So on top of what we've already had so far, we've got another 8 places from the rabbis. Here we go. Nain, Gergesa, and finally Nazareth. So what we've got here is 22 out of the 27 place names in the Gospels, which are known from sources, Jewish sources specifically, outside of the New Testament, outside of the Gospels. Now, what I want to do finally, and we're near the end now, so don't start panicking. What I want to do finally is to see is that good? Is 22 out of 27 good? If you're sort of sitting a health and safety exam, it's probably not very good. But is 22 out of 27 place names a good score or a bad score? So what I want to do here is to engage in a couple of comparisons to see how this fares. The first comparison I want to make is with the Jewish historian Josephus, whom I've already mentioned already. Now, Josephus, I think, is quite a good figure to compare with the Gospel writers. And specifically, I want to focus on Josephus's autobiography. I think this is a good point of comparison with the Gospel writers because Josephus's autobiography is almost exactly the same length as a Gospel. It's almost exactly the same length specifically with John's Gospel, a bit longer than Mark, a bit shorter than Matthew and Luke. So it's a comparable sort of text from the same time frame, from the end of the 1st century. Josephus is also a figure who, like Jesus, but for very different reasons, traveled a lot around Judea and Galilee. So what do we find when we look at the place names in Josephus? Well, he has a massive number of them, actually, even more than the Gospels. The Gospels have a pretty high concentration. Josephus has 44 towns. And I think it's fair to say that, on my count at least, from looking into it, 35 of these are attested outside of Josephus in other Jewish literature, and I've added in classical literature and Christian literature here to help him along a little bit, but not very much, because most of it's in Jewish literature. 35 out of 44, 9 of them not attested. And with the Gospels, we've got 22 out of 27. Now, for the Gospels, 22 out of 27 is 81%, and for Josephus, 35 out of 44 is 80%. Now, and actually, if you separate out the Gospels individually, the score of the Gospels looks even better, but just for the sake of argument here, keeping them together. Now, I think these figures are striking because no one for a minute doubts that Josephus has absolutely, blue chip, proper eyewitness knowledge of Galilee and Judea. He was a native of Jerusalem, spent a lot of his military career in Galilee, really knew the place inside out. So what we can see here is the Gospel writers fare just as well as this person whom we know really knew his geographical stuff. Now, as a second kind of comparison, so that's one comparison, Josephus. The second kind of comparison I want to draw in a totally different kind of literature, one which I've worked on a fair bit over the last 10 years or so, namely the apocryphal Gospels. So I think one of the things we notice, two things really we notice when we compare the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, with the apocryphal, non-canonical Gospels outside of the New Testament, we notice two ways in which they differ. First of all, the relative absence of geographical detail in the non-canonical Gospels. So the Gospel of Truth has no places at all. The Gospel of Mary doesn't really either, because but I don't want to sort of stress that too much, because the Gospel of Mary is very fragmentary, and so it may have had some places mentioned in the bits we don't have anymore. The Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas have two places, the world and Judea. So not actually any towns, but the Gospel of Philip does have the world, but also Jerusalem, and a possible reference to Nazareth, but it's not clear that it's being treated as a place name exactly. So, as I think you can see here, it's not exactly pinpoint geographical accuracy that we're dealing with in the cases of these apocryphal Gospels outside of the New Testament. The second thing that we often find in these apocryphal Gospels is where we do have geographical detail, that they often make a bit of a hash of it. So, to give you some cases here, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, which is often referred to as a gospel or a gospel-like text, refers to the Mount of Olives being in Galilee. Now, that's about 70 miles out, because the Mount of Olives, of course, is next to Jerusalem, and Galilee is a fair way north. In the infancy Gospel of Thomas, we have a similar mistake, a reference to the region of Bethlehem in the town of Nazareth. So again, a kind of a muddling of Galilee and Judea, a muddling of the north and south, and sort of conflating them all into one place regarding Jesus was sort of born in Bethlehem but from Nazareth, therefore they must be sort of next door to each other or one part of the other. The Gospel of Barnabas, a medieval Islamic forgery of a gospel, has Jesus, this is my favorite actually, Jesus sailing to Nazareth. Now Nazareth it's a bit like sort of talking about sailing from London to, I don't know, Kansas City, I suppose. Nazareth is inland. You can't sail there very easily. That's why Switzerland doesn't have a fleet. And finally, the Gospel of Philip has an extensive discussion of the temple. Gospel of Philip says the following: there were 3 buildings specifically for sacrifice in Jerusalem. The one facing east was called the Holy, another facing south was called the Holy of the Holy, the third facing east was called the Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest enters. Now, all this stuff about different buildings facing east, south, and west is pretty bonkers, really. And as one of the most sort of sympathetic commentators on the Gospel of Philip mentions, and this is someone who actually was really a bit of a proper Gnostic, really loved the Gnostic literature. So he regards this as a bit of a shame that the Gospel of Philip gets all this wrong, and refers, this is my translation of his German, to the irritatingly unrealistic topography of the temple. And one could give some extra examples of this from apocryphal literature as well. What we can see, I think, illustrated here, both in the absence of reference to geographical detail, but also in these howlers that turn up when they start talking about geography, is that this is what happens when you try to write about the geography of Jesus and his ministry if you don't know your stuff. This is the kind of mistake that you make. It's hard, and this illustrates, I think, the point that it's hard to fake accurate geography. If you try to, you get it wrong. So the New Testament gospel writers couldn't possibly have got the details that they get right, I don't think, unless they had eyewitness knowledge or knowledge from eyewitness sources. So in conclusion, I really am wrapping up now. Scholars have found then so far in the Old Testament, Josephus, and the Rabbinic literature, 22 out of 27 places known. And even the other ones that we don't know from elsewhere, Magadan, Dalmanutha, Bethany, Enon, and Salim, they have Semitic-sounding names, and in some of the cases, like Salim, the problem is not that it's not mentioned in rabbinic literature, but we just don't know the particular one that is the gospel one. Bethany as well is perhaps there in rabbinic literature as well. I'm working on that at the moment. But so there are 5 at least that we don't really know of. So when you next find yourself in a library, perhaps there's one in the Lanier Theological Library, leafing through some unpublished rabbinic manuscripts, keep an eye out for me and look for Magadan, Dalmanutha, Bethany, Enon, and Salim. But seriously, 22 out of 27, as we've seen from the comparison with Josephus, is a very reassuring number, the percentage with Josephus being almost exactly the same. And this is a similar kind of project in some ways to what Richard Borkham has done in examining the personal names. And I think you've heard Pete Williams here talking about some of Professor Borkham's research on that. Just as the gospel writers get the personal names, the patterns of naming Jews in the first century right, so also the Gospels get the patterns of place names right as well. On the other hand, when we compare the New Testament Gospel writings with the others outside of the Bible, we can see even more clearly how much detail and accuracy there is in the 4 New Testament Gospels. Let me finish with a quotation from one of the most eminent classicists, one of the most eminent ancient historians alive today, Professor Sir Fergus Miller of, I regret to say, Oxford University, but this is what he has written in a very famous book, The Roman Near East, based on some lectures at Harvard. The Gospels provide an extremely vivid and, in geographical terms, quite extensive view of what the area of Jewish settlement was in Jesus' time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.